So welcome everybody this evening. My name is Denise Charlton and I am the Chief Executive of the Community Foundation for Ireland. We're just waiting a couple more seconds as people come into the room, so I hope you'll bear with us. Okay, we'll set off. Thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. We're going to spend the next hour and a half thinking and talking about domestic violence, and we have some fantastic speakers lined up for you. As I said, my name is Denise Charlton. I'm the Chief Executive of the Community Foundation for Ireland, and I have the great pleasure of chairing today's session as well. So I'll start with a couple of opening remarks, and then I'll introduce us to our wonderful speakers. So recover better, stand up for human rights. That's the theme of the United Nations, the theme that they have picked for today, International Human Rights Day 2020. And the world body makes it clear that they don't want us to go back to the pre-COVID world with its stark inequalities, discrimination, and of course, rampant gender-based violence. It's no coincidence that the day marks the end of the designated 16 days of action to end domestic violence and abuse in all its forms. Over this period, those who advocate for victims, for those who are experiencing gender-based violence, for supports, for justice are to the fore in highlighting the need for action, and many of them are speaking today, are in the room as participants. It's also a time, as we know, when governments and politicians very often have strong words to say and make commitments around the issues. This time, though, it feels a little different than before, and that probably is just due to the alarming rise of the reported cases of violence during the pandemic and the terrible hallmarks of this pandemic. Gardaí, as many of you will be aware, are reporting a 17% rise in domestic violence crime, over 20,000 calls. And we know that that's far from the full story. We know that for many reasons, some women won't report to the police or go to state agencies. And so if we look at the figures from frontline agencies, it's much starker and of course, much darker. From the early days of COVID-19, Women's Aid with us here today, 43% up in the first few weeks alone. And we've heard from Gardaí as well that it's a time where one terrible aspect of the lockdown is that the number of children who have witnessed abuse or seen their mother assaulted has happened for the first time. So a tipping point. If it's not a tipping point now, I don't really know what might be. The Community Foundation for Ireland, we have been engaged and working with the issue of domestic violence for many years. I'd like to pay tribute to our founder, Tina Roach, and to our wonderful staff who are engaging with the issues. We've had the pleasure, and I was one of those organisations before I joined CFI, we've had the pleasure of working with organisations and individuals, and many of you have joined us for our first in our series of VitalTalks. Over the last 20 years, we hope that we've had the back and supported much of your work. As an organisation, CFI doesn't shy away from difficult or complex issues, deeply embedded issues. It tries to be there with partners to the forefront of them. 60 million of the money in grants that have gone out over the last 2 decades have gone to support issues which we believe didn't have a simple or straightforward solution. And we would like to partner with people in trying to look at how we might progress issues such as travellers' rights, marriage equality, immigration reform, and we try with partners to support in what way we can. We believe that through philanthropy, we've been able to go beyond firefighting and offer some strategic and sustainable funding that allows long-term planning, in addition to supporting immediate and direct needs. We hope that this approach allows and facilitates new ideas, new approaches, and leads to supports for individuals, as well as policy, legal, and social change. As a convener, we try to provide the opportunity for men, women and children who've been impacted by social issues, who support them and who advocate on their behalf, come together to formulate new ideas, new collaborations and new solutions. And today is one of those. Our range of speakers this evening, we're so privileged to have them all with us. And we believe that they will offer really thought-provoking contributions reflecting the complexities that are involved in these issues. The end of 16 days of action will happen tonight, and traditionally it can be a time when political, public and media spotlight move on to other issues. It can be a time also where we feel that actually during the 16 days, significant and important awareness raising has happened, and very often that can result in changes, progress, new funding, new legislation. Over the years, the 16-day initiative has been really important in doing all of that. This year, with the increases, it feels a little different, and we owe to everyone who has ever experienced domestic violence or is just experiencing domestic violence, who's been locked up, imprisoned with their abuser, in a place where most of us see it as our rock, our place of safety, the family home, to keep the issue on the political agenda. The volunteers, the frontline workers and those on helplines, they work way beyond the 16 days. They're working 365 days. And so we want to support them in identifying the supports, the policies and the laws that might make a difference to those who are experiencing domestic violence. We want to keep the momentum going. We want to work together. We want to continue to support them in being as courageous and energetic as they always are. We want to see how we might use partnerships, how our donors might continue to support the work you do, and to see how partnerships like those offered by philanthropy can move the issue, can continue to turn the dial, and can deliver the real change that we want to see. So in conclusion, the pandemic may well have been a wake-up call to the country when it comes to gender-based violence, not for those in the room, but for others. And as alarming as the statistics are this year, I suppose the fear is that in the coming weeks to Christmas and the New Year, that for some, the danger will increase. As I mentioned at the outset, the UN theme for today is recover. It's also worth noting that Ireland cannot meet its international commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals until it ends gender-based violence and domestic violence. The goals are clear, no one can be left behind, an ambitious task. Our goal is to try and make sure that they are delivered in full. So the work of the Community Foundation, we're just here as a support and a partner, and we want to work with those who share our vision of equality for all in thriving communities. It is our generous donors that have supported this work, as I said, and their gifts and legacies make our support possible. So for any potential donors that are listening and have joined us this morning, and if you want to be part of this struggle and solution, please let us know. I thank you all for gathering with us on what is World Human Rights Day. And it is right that we should mark it, and it is right that we should ensure that the awareness raising, the advocacy and the action of the past 16 days will now continue beyond 2021. We hope to play our part in supporting you all, and delighted to have you with us. So I'll move on now and I'll introduce our speakers. First we have Mary, who is the co-CEO of Safe Ireland. Safe Ireland is the national policy and service hub for 39 domestic violence organisations across the country. And Mary will be known to many in the room. She's a feminist theorist, an educator, an activist with a particular interest in the connections between the personal and social change. Mary has worked across the university sector, NGO, community development sectors around positive social change for the last 30 years. As co-CEO of Self Ireland, she's committed to eradicating the coercive, pervasive social problem of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Mary, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Denise, and we're very glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the evening and talking to all my colleagues in the sector about this very serious problem. So we have 10 minutes each as a speaker for the hour or so that we'll be speaking with you. And I simply thought I would divide my presentation into two sections, and I'm simply going to call it the old normal and the new normal. And I'm speaking in the seat of my previous, the previous CEO of Safe Ireland, Sharon O'Halloran, who was CEO for 20 years. And she has had a very close relationship with the Community Foundation of Ireland for that time. And I want to speak directly to the steady and dedicated support that the Foundation gave to Safe Ireland during that time and what it enabled. Over the course of that period of time, with steady and predictable funding, the organisation was able to address core issues in domestic violence in Ireland. We did so at a government level, and I'm just going to gesture here. I'm not going to give you a shopping list of successes or indeed failures. I'm just going to gesture to the areas that were important to us. The most important one at a legislative level was the introduction of coercive control. And I'll speak about that, how important that has proved to be under the new normal. So that was a large body of research and a lot of lobbying to introduce coercive control as a crime, which has fundamentally changed the face of domestic violence in the country and how it's dealt with, but it has also raised problems. And again, I'll speak to that later. Well, maybe not problems, challenges, I think, are a better way of putting it. The other work that we have done over the last 5 years in the old normal is a large body of work around under the general heading of safe homes, safe communities. And what that has really meant has been working to create really strong, flexible interagency connections at local level. And an example of that is yesterday I was at a day-long webinar which had over 800 and I think it was 860 participants from around the world who were talking about coercive control and how that affects frontline agencies. And so we were speaking, it was the Nurses and Midwifery Education Department in GMIT organised it. But at the webinar, and I was fascinated to see the range of people who were at it, were police, nurses, teachers, social workers, all those gateway professionals who are so crucial in that interface between the individual and the institution, and how very engaged they were about domestic violence, and how through the work in Mayo in this particular instance, the vocabulary, the analysis, and the programs for action were really very sophisticated. As well as it being heartbreaking to listen to the evidence of the breadth and depth of domestic violence in the country. During that period as well, Safe Ireland brought into itself the Mayo Women's Support Services, and they are a refuge and a support service based in Mayo, a very high functioning refuge and support service, a marvelous team. They're of 15 or 16 people. You can imagine what they've had to do now in COVID. And we had to talk quite a bit last week about the impact of having to create separate rotating teams and the pressures that that places on providing services, on continuing helplines, on continuing face-to-face and outreach work, and on the work of trying to provide housing, court accompaniment, and all those things that the frontline services of Safe Ireland members do all around the country. More generally, during the old normal, as if you'll bear with me, just to use that word for the moment, Safe Ireland has worked consistently with the court services, with the Legal Aid Board, with the policing authority, again, to get that frontline gateway professional work done and set out very clearly. We've also, of course, continued to have good alliances with universities in our research projects. We have an economic costs research coming out shortly, and I'm afraid a very depressing piece of research on gender attitudes and gender-based violence, but more of that anon. So that is generally what I will call the old normal. The new normal is, as we all know, and I'm just going to use two words to head it: COVID and coercive control. So COVID, as we know, is changing the face of the world, and it will not go back in one way or another. It is changing the nature of space. It is changing the nature of the relationship between the private and public world. And it is going to change the nature of work. All these things we know are going to have huge impact on employee and employer responsibility around health and safety. We know that, for example, we're working, like others, on the domestic violence paid leave employee bill. And we're also, in terms of privacy and the public and what it means to be a person even, or space, the harassment and harmful communications and digital violence, basically, and all of that. So that we're aware that in COVID, what is reality is being really, really reconfigured on almost every front. When it comes to coercive control, I remember when I saw it, I remember thinking, oh my God, this is going to lift a rock. This could make things a lot better or a lot worse. And introducing coercive control into as a crime, but into the vocabulary around domestic violence makes things much more complex. One of the great wins out of it is that we now have a deepening and really much more sturdy understanding around what heretofore would have been called collusion. So the great fear and fatalism and inertia around domestic violence generally has often gone back to, but she'll always go back to him. When we understand coercive control, we really understand what sustained trauma induces, and we're allowed to do that in a formal legal way. So the introduction of coercive control really cannot be underestimated. By the same token, we also are working across what I might call class lines, and by that, or category lines is a better phrase. And by that, I mean, we worked very hard during COVID to introduce the domestic violence rent supplement, which was successful. And that is changing, again, the nature of the understanding of domestic violence, because it means that anybody, regardless of their class background, because we know financial abuse is a core element of domestic violence, can present to their local service or indeed to the Department of Social Protection. And without a means test, a crucial piece of, a crucial barrier heretofore, they can access accommodation support for 3 months. And Safe Ireland worked to bring that into place since last March. I won't speak for too much longer now because I know we have a long evening ahead of us and looking forward to it. What I will say is there are two elements that are very important for us. One is that more generally within the NGO sector, it is, and I was at a large meeting in the last number of months, it is virtually impossible to insert the domestic violence vocabulary into that. And we are working very hard to do that now, to broaden out the NGO sector and all agents for social change to include domestic violence into their analysis and into their programs of work. And I suppose lastly, since COVID outbreak, we are very aware of the need for funding. And we have had wonderful responses. We dispersed 500,000 euro with our COVID emergency fund through the support of arts and business and so forth directly to women and children. But we were talking internally about funding and what that means. And the rise of the GoFundMe, the individual, often crisis-driven, often reactionary type of fundraising. And in the light of all of that, how very important the likes of the Community Foundation of Ireland is for funding groups like ours, because we want to act strategically. We want to be ahead of the curve, and we believe we are, because we know what the new normal is going to bring down the line. There are many problems that are coming. Children are one. The courts, I'll raise the issue of parental alienation and other tactics that are emerging. And I use the word tactics advisedly. There are very serious problems arising that are new forms of domestic violence and control. And we are ahead of the curve on it, actually, but we need support to do it. Your support during the old normal was really, really crucial. We were absolutely prepared for COVID and could snap into place when it hit. But we need continued support, because when the new normal kicks in, there is more difficulties to face, and we need your support to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, and really hearing that message of, historical, the steady and predictable funding and the outcomes that were able to be achieved by it, and then the call for moving from emergency funding to keep that predictable funding. Thanks also for highlighting some of the wins that have been achieved on behalf of women, as well as the challenges that we now face. Thanks, Mary. I'm going to now introduce Mary Louise. Mary Louise is the founder of CC, Survivors Standing Together to Eliminate Intimate Abuse. Mary Louise herself is a survivor of abuse while she navigated the systems in Ireland. She once worked in a family retail business and tried paths through education, temporary employment, while living with abuse and navigating it. So she knows the systems well, she knows how to navigate them, she knows the difficulties and the challenges. And she's put all that, combining that knowledge and expertise with the energy and commitment that she has to make a difference. Her academic background is philosophy and history, transformative leadership, and she's currently studying an MA in UCD. Mary Louise, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Denise, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I'm so grateful that the Community Foundation has already supported CC with some seed funding, which was just enough to give us the confidence to keep building on what we have already come to believe to be a formula, a way out of ongoing control for survivors of intimate partner abuse. And I look across and I see the other organizations presenting here today, and every single one of them have helped me. The women who are in CC, who contact CC, have all been helped by these organizations. There's not a chance that I would have the courage to sit here today if it weren't for all of the help that I've received. I know I spoke to you the other day, Denise, and I shared some of CC's progress so far. And I have a photo of myself and some of the founding members of CC at a Safe Ireland summit, where we were just wrapped up in understanding. We found our tribe, we heard speakers from all over the world, and we knew people are aware what's happening. There is another way. The language of abuse is not a dirty secret. And what happens to people who are under immense pressure, who become isolated, who become downtrodden, there are people in our corner. But I think one of the most inspiring things that has come about through meeting other survivors is the incredible wealth of strength and experience that survivors have themselves, and an innate and unique understanding of how to move beyond the obstacles that are presented, both in the personal context of living with coercive control, but also in trying to protect oneself and protect one's children in the up against the most horrendous obstacles that are put there by our state services. And I'm not talking about frontline services. I'm talking about, our legal frameworks. I'm talking about our standard codes of practice, procedure, child protection. Anything that is a rule can be abused. Anything that is a law can be used as a stick to beat somebody with. And while we have, in the last 10 years, we have seen wonderful advancements when it comes to domestic violence legislation and the implementation of coercive control. While we still have a culture of relative secrecy, and we don't allow our own survivors, we do allow international survivors, but our own survivors to stand front and center and be heard and share their collective experience, well, then translating the different forms of control and how they are acted out upon people is very hard to convey. And I think that's where survivors can fill a gap that has been created through the advancements, where we can share our experience of engaging with the guards, engaging with the court services, engaging with our child and family agency, engaging with schools, trying to navigate when the places that one goes to for safety and hopes that our children will be taken care of become battlegrounds, and how to articulate that. And it was great to hear Mary raising the point there of, you know, the kind of the so-called parental alienation, which has become almost accepted as a reality, when I don't believe, and I know the survivors that CC is working with, and I know through other international survivor organizations that we are connected to, coercive control and parental alienation, the theory of it, they can't coexist. But it is only by giving those who have experienced the ongoing pattern of coercive control their voice that we can determine that. We have a long way to go here in Ireland when it comes to collecting evidence and data, and recording that and allowing it to be owned and used to inform by survivors themselves. You know, we only have to look at what happened very recently with the Repeal the Seal campaign. Survivors have trust issues, and yet we as a culture tend to not trust women once they have come forwards, once they declare having been abused, once they say, I want to stand up against this, I want to do something to protect myself, I want to use my lived experience and transform that into an asset. All of a sudden skepticism she's met with at every turn. And I think we can build on campaigns like the Together for Yes campaign, where we repealed the 8th Amendment, where we can trust women. Nobody is saying that any one survivor has the truth, has all the truth or all the answers, but the collective experience will reveal common patterns and threads. And that can tie in very, very effectively with the work that is being done by incredible agencies all across the board. So what we are asking is for direct investment in survivors themselves, so that we can train, so that we can educate each other, so that we can educate services, we can educate the state, the community, and we can take our rightful place as equal citizens, you know, out of the shadows of abuse. We're very, very capable. Women who have survived ongoing abuse have the most incredible resources, and they're transferable skills. And we just need a little bit of help to put some kind of structure on that, and to say, we believe in where you want to get to. We see your potential and we'd like to help you get there. We'd like to see you and your family, after everything you've been through, thrive and flourish. And I think really that is a basic human right. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say that today. And we're really looking forward to as well the conversation later on.
Thanks, Mary-Louise. Just so important, and you articulated so clearly the need to have survivors central to all the work and to the recovery and the response. One of our participants has just highlighted how they came into contact with CC and felt so heard, and just, I suppose, amplifying further the amazing work that you're doing. So thanks for your presence today and your input. I'll move now on to Sarah Benson. So Sarah is the current Chief Executive CEO of Women's Aid. Women's Aid has been one of the leading national domestic violence organisations offering support and advocacy, supporting thousands of women every year, free holistic services through its helpline, outreach and training. Also a great organisation in terms of lobbying and campaigning, raising awareness, and have over the years really had an impact in changing public attitudes and policies in relation to domestic violence and abuse. Sarah, you're very welcome.
Hi Denise, good evening, and huge thanks to yourself and the Community Foundation team both for the invitation to be a part of this conversation and also just for your support this year during a year like no other, I think it's fair to say. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and in order to allow the ISL interpreter to be sufficiently visible, that means I'm going to drop off my own video and I will pop back again afterwards. Hopefully this will work. Pardon me. Okay. As I said, Sarah Benson's my name. Denise has very generously introduced the organization. And
Sarah, you need to share your PowerPoint.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Sorry about that. A bit zoomed out, I think. So everything that Mary has already said, and indeed Mary Louise as well, in terms of the crucial role of survivors in terms of combating, preventing and overcoming domestic violence and abuse has resonated. I'm going to be focusing more specifically on a particular area of work, just something that we have been working on this year based on a campaign we've been running for some time and work we hope to be developing into the future, and we're quite excited about. And that will be young people's experience of intimate relationship abuse. As Denise has said, we run a range of services ourselves, and that is really just a snapshot there. And likewise of our outputs in the last year. And I think Denise already mentioned our numbers in terms of responding during the COVID-19 crisis have been much higher again, with a 43% increase in calls responded to by the National Free Phone Helpline between March and June of this year compared with 2019. But what I'm going to be talking about now is some of the key findings from our new report about intimate relationship abuse among young people in Ireland. And this report, which we launched at the very start of the 16 Days Against Violence Against Women, November 25th, builds on women's AIDS awareness work through our 2 Into You campaign, which we've been running since 2011. And we felt for quite some time that more was required to better understand, prevent and combat abuse in intimate relationships amongst our young people. There is really very little research to help us to even gauge the prevalence and nature of what we're dealing with in Ireland. And so with this in mind, we were delighted to be able to collaborate with Red C in order to try and begin to fill our knowledge gaps and make the strong case for a greater focus on young people's and particularly young women's experience of abuse at the hands of their current or former intimate partners. We deliberately are using the language here of intimate relationship abuse because part of the work involved taking the national survey response and bringing it to a number of focus groups. And we wanted to also ask about language because we know domestic implies living with somebody. Violence often infers physical violence. And we were aware that dating abuse, which was a term that we had been using, might not really resonate with young people in this jurisdiction. It's quite Americanized. So with the support of the young people we consulted, we've landed with intimate relationship abuse. So the survey also captured the experience of abuse below the age of 18 as well. We did a nationally representative sample of 18 to 25-year-olds weighted to our national population of 51% male, 49% female. And as I say, then conducted focus groups to further the knowledge from the process. So our research found that abuse from a current or former partner is common amongst young people. 3 in 5 young people have either personally experienced or know someone who has experienced abuse in a current or former intimate relationship under the age of 25. And it also indicates that it is a heavily gendered phenomenon. It's particularly women who suffer at the hands of a male current or former partner. with a startling 1 in 5 young women surveyed having experienced abuse, 100% of them by a current or former intimate male partner. This contrasts with 1 in 11 young men, of whom 88% experienced abuse from a current or former female partner and 22% from a current or former male partner. I think what was the most troubling finding for us was that 51% of women reported that the abuse they experienced started below the age of 18, with 18 being the average age which women have been subjected to it. Again, not surprisingly to us, but an important finding was that while physical violence may be the most visible and most commonly discussed form of abuse, emotional abuse is highly prevalent, with 9 out of 10 women who suffered reporting this experience. And as we and our colleagues, Safe Ireland and the other organisations know well, indeed CC likewise, that the devastating impacts of emotional abuse, which doesn't leave a physical mark, but can be both difficult to identify and also difficult to seek assistance and support for. And indeed, one of the things that young people would say is that some of the emotionally abusive tactics very early in relationships can certainly be mistaken for passion or infatuation in the early stages. And this report details, indeed, additionally, the other worrying forms of abuse which were reported to us, including sexual coercion, rape, physical violence, and coercive control, of which emotional abuse is a core component. One tactic we particularly wanted to learn more about was online abuse and abuse using digital technology, and alarmingly 1 in 2 young women who'd suffered abuse had experienced it online through the use of digital technology. And that can be particularly devastating because of that always-on nature of life online. It is very draining, and it can often feel inescapable because it's difficult to completely block an abuser from making contact. And neither is it a reasonable solution to ask a young person to opt out of or switch off their social media presence, because this is just so deeply ingrained in their social lives. And fundamentally, a victim should not suffer for the actions of a perpetrator. In Ireland, legislation has fallen badly behind the fast-paced digital world, and urgent measures are needed to prevent intimate relationship abuse from occurring online, as well as combating the vast amount of misogyny and vitriol that women in general are subjected to every day online. The impacts on young women, very similar to those from the sample across the life course, should not be underestimated. Even when a relationship is quite short term, they can be terribly intense. And so women reported high levels of low self-esteem, depression, isolation, suicide ideation, and in some instances hospitalization as a result of physical abuse. But one of the things that really struck us was that, similar to a survey that we commissioned last year of women experiencing domestic abuse, 32% of young women who had been abused had told nobody. And very similar to the findings of our other survey, the two number one reasons were understandably fear of the perpetrator, but also stigma, embarrassment, shame, worrying that other people would know what was going on, and feeling that they may be blamed for their own abuse. So we had a couple of recommendations which I'd like to share with you. What we need is more research. Research begets research. Data is vital. We need more in-depth research on young people aged 18 to 25, but we also need separate research into the prevalence and impact on under 18s in an ethically suitable way, considering we're talking about minors. We also need a greater awareness raising and education from primary level right up to third level in terms of promoting healthy and helping to identify unhealthy relationships amongst young people. And this needs to be done in the context of promoting greater gender equality, respect, and mutuality. So teaching on intimate relationship abuse should be a key component of relationships and sexuality education. And respect for boundaries and the importance of consent needs to be included in age-appropriate ways at all levels, and not just as there's some great work happening at third level, but it needs to be starting far, far sooner. We also clearly need public awareness and social change work to reduce stigma and victim blaming, because this is clearly a massive barrier to those who are suffering, feeling able to trust a disclosure. And we also need to raise awareness of the actual legal remedies and support services that are out there and available. And as has been alluded to already, we also need legislation. We have the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offences Bill, which is moving very fast at the moment. In fact, a little too fast, because there's some work needs doing on it. But the Minister has committed to enacting that before Christmas, which will be welcome. But we also need civil remedies, because very often in instances of things like image-based abuse, the victims don't necessarily want to pursue a criminal case. What they want is they want the material taken down, and taken down fast. And we do have the Online Safety and Media Regulations Bill, but at the moment, as that's drafted, it is still very inadequate. And we, along with others, key stakeholders in the domestic and sexual violence organisations, but also children's rights and other organisations, will be looking very carefully at that, because at the moment it isn't going to be sufficient for what's needed to provide civil remedies for online harassment and image-based abuse. So that will be part of our advocacy, along with our colleagues and allies in that respect. And overall, I suppose I'll finish by just saying, you know, this is about us all needing to come together as the community of Ireland, to work together and to continue to communicate a constant message that it's never your fault, that you will be believed, and that there is support there for anyone who suffers in this way. And I'll end on that note, and thank you so much for your time and the chance to be here today.
Thanks, Sarah. It's shocking. I know we shouldn't be shocked by the research and the stats, but they really are so shocking in terms of just the prevalence and how it continues, and the new battlegrounds, I suppose, that are emerging. So thanks a million. We'll be able to unpack that a little bit more in the questions and answers, and some very clear asks for you around more research and support around legislative change. So thanks so much for that. Our next speaker, Teresa, works with the Immigrant Council of Ireland, an independent law centre that has been working with the rights of people with a migration background, and have been to the forefront of, I suppose, raising the additional barriers for those affected by domestic violence, and also to the forefront of other, I suppose, themes or areas of sexual violence. Working with human trafficking and prostitution. Teresa is a Polish migrant woman herself, a leader in Ireland. She works as the integration manager with the ICI, and she's a qualified trainer in diversity management, intercultural competency, and has huge expertise, and is a leader in the anti-racism response. She's published in Ireland and internationally on racism, integration best practices, and integration politics. And we were all delighted to see in December that Teresa was appointed to the board of the Arts Council. Teresa, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation and including me in this very important discussion. I'm speaking to you today both as a child survivor of domestic violence and as a migrant woman. And this is going to be quite difficult conversation for me, because speaking about domestic violence has a triggering effect on me. And for many years, I was trying not to engage actively in this area to protect my mental health. However, this year I started working with a network of migrant women. Most of them are working on the ground, tackling domestic violence that's affecting migrant women. And I realized that I don't have the luxury anymore to stay silent on those issues, because the voices of migrant women are being completely disregarded from a public debate. And I have a platform, and I need to use that platform to speak about migrant women until we are being heard. The Irish government this year is positioning itself as completely committed to tackling domestic violence. The campaign Still Here was set up by the government, and there is a website where victims of the domestic violence can find information and support about the issues that they are facing. None of those efforts, no information on that website is in relation to migrant women. migrant women suffer specific issues that are specific to migrant women and nobody else experiences them, and they cannot find any information about how to address these issues on those websites. So Irish government cannot really claim that they are fully committed to tackling domestic violence if they are completely forgetting about the needs of migrant women. In addition, Irish government cannot claim that they are fully committed to ending domestic violence if there are state policies that are actually keeping migrant women in situations of domestic violence. And I will be mentioning here only two issues. One is the Stamp 3 dependent visa. Stamp 3 is given to migrant people who are coming to Ireland to join partners. 90% of those stamps are given to migrant women. Stamp 3 ties immigration status of a woman to the partner, and also people on Stamp 3 are not able to work. They are legally forbidden from work, so they are losing the financial independence. What we find out from our work on the ground is that this immigration status is being used as a coercive control by abusers. Migrant women need to renew their immigration status once a year, but they need the signature of the partner on the immigration papers. And we've heard that the partners, the abusers, are refusing to sign the immigration papers to make women undocumented, because then they can implement even more control over women's life. So state policies, immigration policies, are already putting women at disadvantage and unequal dynamics in the relationship, because they are at the beginning of life of migrant women in Ireland, putting them in a dependent status from the abusers. In addition, we have also undocumented women in Ireland who are in fear of reporting domestic violence, because this is a state policy that their immigration status will be investigated. So women will not go to the guards to report domestic violence, because they are in fear that they will be deported. In addition, many women are being given false information by their abusers that if they report domestic violence, they will be deported, that their children will be deported. And there is a lot of misconceptions around legal status that migrant women have, and how is that being used against them to implement coercive control over migrant women. So this is the issue that we are facing now. Couple of years ago, there was a change introduced to the law to allow migrant women who are on Stamp 3 to apply for independent legal status if they fall victims to domestic violence. But my question is, do we really need to put migrant women through the trauma of domestic violence before we recognize their right to independent legal status? I'm 38 years of age, and I still deal with the trauma of domestic abuse I was subjected to as a child. Can you imagine what it has to be for migrant women as well? The trauma will last for many years, if not forever. And in response to the lack of migrant women issues being part of the state efforts to tackle domestic violence, we started our own campaign. We are still here too. That's the name of our campaign, because our voices are not being heard and our issues are not being addressed. And with this campaign, we collected stories from migrant women, random stories, because we put that campaign very quickly together, when we're not only hearing how the immigration status and other state policies are actually adding and enabling domestic violence against migrant women. We also heard about the barriers that migrant women face when they try seek support. Language barrier is one of the most common barriers that exist there, but there is also barrier with cultural stigma, with cultural limitation. In many cultures, it is not allowed to talk about your issues with domestic violence with anyone from outside of your close circle or people that you trust. There is also an issue with racism and discrimination. We've heard from migrant women that when they are looking for support, they are being called names. Their children are being called names. They are being asked invasive questions. So migrant women who might have been married to an Irish citizen, they are being asked if they got married only to get visa. They are being told to go back to their country of origin. They are being told to foster out their children here in Ireland and go back to their home country. Racism and discrimination is an issue that it hasn't been discussed at all yet when it comes to supporting victims of domestic violence. And I know that some mainstream services are offering interpreting services to migrant women, but the question is like, there is still very low level of engagement of migrant women with mainstream services. And we need to ask question why. And the reason is trust, lack of trust. Migrant women who are already in fear that they might lose their immigration status, they are already being told that they are not welcome here because they suffered racism and discrimination, looking for support services, will not trust you and will not come you, even if you have the most wonderful interpreting services. But what's happening instead is that migrant women are looking for support from other migrant women. And currently, there is a network of migrant women working on the ground, providing emergency supports to migrant women, from providing emergency accommodation, emergency financial support, buying nappies for children, because there is nothing else, no other places where migrant women can go to ask for support, especially if they are undocumented. And we had stories of migrant women who were undocumented because their husbands refused to renew their status. They went to look for support from social welfare offices. Instead, they got threats that they will be deported instead of getting help. So what we are really looking at is to really support migrant women working on the ground in the work that they're doing. We already have women who are standing up for each other on a daily basis without any support, any state investments or any investments from anyone else. These women who are volunteering, providing these emergency services, they work full time. They are students, they have families, but they spend every single free moment of their time supporting other migrant women because there's nothing else, there's no other places where migrant women can go. And that is not sustainable. That is not going to change the situation in the long term, because that is going to lead to burnout. And these women who are currently providing emergency support will eventually burn out. And then the women who are in a situation of domestic abuse will have nowhere else to go because they will lose their last points of support. So what we are looking to do, we would like to put a little bit of support and structure around what we call community navigators. These are women who are embedded in their communities. They can infiltrate communities because they are members of those communities. They have the trust of the communities, and they can reach to the most marginalized and isolated women. They can link them with service providers, and they can provide trusted relationship between abused women and service providers. And that is already happening, but it's happening on a voluntary basis. And as I said, that's not going to be sustainable for a long term. So what we need investment into the work that is already being delivered by migrant women on the ground. And we need to support these women by giving them financial support, structural support, and also giving them platform to voice their concerns and inviting them to the decision-making tables where they can finally tell the stories that what happened to them, and they can build the new structures that will tackle domestic violence in all communities, including the migrant communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Thanks for sharing your own experience so bravely, and for articulating so well the additional barriers for migrant women in terms of accessing service, in terms of having a voice, and in the ask, which is supporting community leaders. And I suppose historically that has been a way that domestic violence has been tackled and responded to in the past. So a very clear ask there. So thanks to you, and we'll be back for that. So last but not least, we have Orla, who is the director of the National Women's Council. And many of you will know the National Women's Council is the leading membership organisation in Ireland, 190 member groups. Orla was the co-director of Together for Yes, and she led that wonderful civil society campaign to remove the 8th Amendment. And she was recognised as one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine in 2019. I love saying that, I never get tired of it. Orla holds an MA in European Social Policy, but she actually started her own career in local community-based project. She's worked in senior management in non-government organisations for over 25 years, and Orla will be known, like the others, to our audience for her commentary on the airwaves around domestic violence, and the National Women's Council are also a lead organisation in this context. So Orla, you're very welcome as well.
Thank you, Denise, and thanks to all the team and Community Foundation for organising this evening and on Human Rights Day. What I thought might be useful, maybe just at the start, is to say where the National Women's Council, comes from in this whole discussion on domestic violence. And in the National Women's Council, we see violence against women as being really at the core of inequality for women, and ending violence against women in all its forms, whether domestic, sexual violence, prostitution, trafficking, female genital mutilation, is all fundamental to women's freedom to participate fully in society. So this really goes to the heart of the work of the Women's Council and to the heart of the members of the Women's Council. We see domestic violence and intimate partner violence as endemic in our society, and I think that really has been put in the spotlight over the course of COVID. And it's also at the heart of male entitlement and male power. And Denise was saying that there are 190 member organisations of the Women's Council, and that includes, the frontline services on domestic violence, and all the organisations who presented here tonight are members of the Women's Council. And I think it's been very clear to all of the members throughout the last number of months just how absolutely critical the frontline services have been in terms of being there for women, providing support for women, and providing that safe space. And I think, it is an enormous credit to those organisations in terms of what they've had to do over the last number of months in terms of rising to the challenge that was there. In addition to the frontline services, there's also survivor organisations, but there's also all of the organisations who reflect the diversity of women in our society: traveller women, migrant women, disabled women, and organisations representing women who are really on the margins of our society: women in addiction, women in prostitution, homeless women, and women in prisons. And we know from our work, and I know from working with the member groups, that domestic violence is a part of what all of these organisations experience in working with women. And it's because of this wide-reaching impact of domestic violence and violence against women on women's lives that the National Women's Council established the Irish Observatory on Violence Against Women. And this is a network of grassroots and national organisations who are members of the Women's Council working solely on the issue of violence against women, and whether they're doing it as a frontline organisation or whether it's another part of their work. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that work of the observatory, and the reason I did is that I really believe that it's critically important, if we're even to come close to ending domestic violence in Ireland and gender-based violence, that collaborative working and collaborative approaches are absolutely necessary. And it's when we work in that way, and I think we have such positive experience of this in Ireland, but when we do that, it's when we are at our most successful and our most best. One of the achievements of the Observatory on Violence Against Women was our campaign, and the campaign by all of the organisations working on violence against women, for Ireland to ratify and sign the Council of Europe Convention on Violence Against Women, which is known as the Istanbul Convention. And after a very long campaign, as so many campaigns around women's rights are, the Irish government signed and ratified in 2019. And what the convention does is it provides a strategic framework, a framework based on 4 pillars: pillars of prevention, protection, prosecution, and then mechanisms and data. And it looks at violence against women in all its forms. And I think one of the successes of the convention is that it provides a very strong victim-centred approach, but also a very comprehensive approach in terms of what's needed, both in terms of services, but also the mechanisms of the state that need to be put in place if states are serious about ending violence against women. And I think that's really important in the current context in Ireland, as there are a number of very important strategic pieces of work that are ongoing by the government. For example, the audit that's currently taking place, or the audit that will start, because it's going to tender from the government. An audit will take place in terms of looking at, strategically, what is the best framework and responsibility for services policies, measures, legislation on gender-based violence. And I think that is so important in terms of looking at how we tackle domestic violence, because domestic violence is so pervasive that it touches all aspects of a woman's life, be it from issues around housing, around healthcare, around financial independence, around childcare services. Once a woman experiences domestic abuse, there is no aspect of her life that is not impacted on. And that requires a comprehensive response by the state if it's seriously going to tackle the issue. And that's why we think in the Women's Council that the Istanbul Convention offers us a framework in order to develop that response. So for example, and I just wanted to give you some examples for maybe why it's helpful and useful. So for example, there's articles in it that relate to custody, visitation rights and safety. And that's really important at the moment as we look to the development of a new family courts bill, because the current bill that's progressing, where so many organisations have raised concerns about, makes no reference to domestic abuse. And family courts, as we know, have been used and abused by perpetrators to continue their abuse. They have manipulated the system to ensure continued control and misery on women. And the Observatory and other organisations have been working to challenge this. For example, calling for the introduction of a court welfare system, also looking for a new system for child maintenance to take it out of the court system and ensure that women who are experiencing domestic abuse do not have to be in situations where they are negotiating with perpetrators. There's similarly articles in the convention that talk about sexual harassment and harassment in all its forms and how it relates to the different forms of violence against women. And this was an issue that today the Observatory had an event on it as part of the 16 days of action, and also used to highlight how we need to place gender within the current hate crime legislation, that it needs to be seen as part of that. There was much discussion today in relation to the need for cyber violence to be recognised in criminal law, and also that it is essential that training and awareness is integrated into any proposed law. So the reason I'm drawing attention to this is to show that the framework of the convention can really provide a strong foundation to advocate and campaign for the type of change that we see as necessary. And just a final piece to mention, Sarah mentioned it as well, I think, in her presentation, but it is the need for data and for research, because if we can't count and measure domestic abuse, we will never be able to end it. And we still have a situation where state bodies are not committed to gathering gender disaggregated data, and particularly in relation to different groups of women. From the little data we have, we know that traveller women, migrant women, women with disabilities experience higher levels of abuse, but tracking their experiences and the barriers that they face is made so much harder by the lack of systemic data collection. Rural migrant women also face very specific barriers that need tailored responses. So we have to be in a situation where we can track a victim's journey from beginning to end to see where the barriers are and to alleviate them. And I mean, I'm just giving some examples of how we think that the convention offers that framework. But I think, this goes back to what Mary McDermott referred to as the new normal. We are in a very different situation, and I think we're at a critical juncture in terms of the responses that are needed now with regard to domestic violence. I think there has been a breakthrough in terms of a national conversation on domestic violence and of the country and of our society seeing domestic violence in a much starker light than they have before. So what we think is now needed is that realization needs to be put in a frame where it leads to very concrete changes. So, for example, what we would like to see, and again, using the convention as a tool and as a mechanism to further things, we want to turn the convention into a very living, live framework. We want to look at it through the prism of a survivor, of a victim, and to look at it in terms of saying, so if the prevention pillar of the convention was to be realized, what would that look like for a migrant woman who's experienced domestic abuse? What difference would it make to a traveller woman who has experienced domestic violence? Today at the Observatory event, Mary Louise from CC spoke about what would a changed court system look like. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to vision this. We need to see in an ideal setting, what would this look like? And then how can we work collectively and collaboratively in order to get there? And I think that's the critical juncture that we're at. It's moving towards the vision and moving towards it in a way that brings us together in a collaborative way. And if we don't do that, then I think we are going to make our journey much, much longer. So there's an important opportunity now, and I think we need to take it. So thank you.
Thanks, Orla. I totally agree with that collaborative approach and call for collaboration, and really appreciate that. And also, I suppose, you surfacing the many aspects of a woman's life that gets affected by domestic violence, and just reminding us of that. And also, again, a call for the voices of survivors and the diversity of that voice to be core and central to every response. I wonder now for the questions and answers, if we can have all the speakers back on the screen. Is that possible? There we go. Great. So just a couple of comments from people. What a great campaign. We are here too. What a great advocate Teresa is. What a superb panel. Thank you to all of them and CFI. Couple of questions. Can you say more on parental alienation and how it can be addressed? And somebody else asking about coercive control. Another comment, Teresa, important issue, working with migrants on employment and employability. Really shocked at the frequency of domestic violence and the isolation and the lack of supports that migrant women face. And in fact, I think the challenge that all women face. And the new battlegrounds of emerging women and children who witness, and again brought so alive by Teresa. So I'm going to ask Sarah, will you take the question just around coercive control?
And what is the full question?
Just to define coercive control, and maybe what are some of the progression that have resulted in the last while?
Sure. Well, I mean, coercive control is, and I've worked on this issue for over 20 years. And when you read the definition of coercive control, it effectively is what domestic violence is. It's what makes it different from that scenario that people sometimes allude to as, where there's the two of them in it and, maybe it's a row in a relationship. Coercive control is about a pattern of behaviors which may or may not themselves on their own be criminal acts, but which have the cumulated effect of one person achieving increased and greater control over the other in the context of a current or former intimate relationship. And you're talking about bringing somebody to the point where their every waking thought is filtered through a consideration of, well, what will he think of this? What will his opinion be of that? If I do this, how is he going to react? And it's referred to in some instances as a liberty crime, because what it does is it has the impact of completely isolating somebody, diminishing their sense of personal freedom, decision making. And I think one of the very important things to recognize is that while it may in some instances include physical or indeed sexual violence. It does not necessarily, and it is an incredibly dangerous form of abuse, because in some instances, as we know from the United Kingdom, where they already undertake domestic homicide reviews, in some instances, the first act of physical violence where there is a coercive controlling relationship is an act of fatal violence. And so it is the backbone of, of an abuser's playbook, as it were. It is multiple tactics which exert increasing control over somebody else. I hope
that's great. Mary-Louise, do you want to comment just from CC's perspective, just around clarifying and I suppose amplifying coercive control? Thanks, Sarah.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll give an example from my own personal experience. And I can remember one night, so desperate for sleep, and there had been visits to my bedroom window during the night, and he could turn up absolutely anywhere at any time. And this is after I had exited, and desperate to move on. And I can remember driving home one night in the pitch dark with all the lights turned off on the car, hoping that he wasn't following me, that I would make it to my parents' house so I could sleep soundly that night. And I gave that example before. I was speaking to somebody recently. Now, imagine I had a child in the back of the car, and imagine what trouble I would be in. It would be my mental health that has to be, rigorously tested. It would be my ability to take care of my child. Anything like that could be reported against me. But the greatest fear is the perpetrator. It's not anything else, because they have become the biggest presence of domination in somebody's life. And I think once that is understood, that's the level of fear that someone is living with, and that I might lose my life at any time, or how far will I be pushed? How bad could it get? And then everything else that goes with that, just like, the point Orla raised, where it touches every aspect of a woman's life. And I've heard it said that, if we focus on the violence, we miss 98% of the coercive control. And that is the telltale sign of just how dangerous someone's situation is the coercive control. So in order to unravel the complexity of coercive control and the way it is acted out, we need to hear survivor stories, and we need to hear the individual ways in which accumulation of tactics has led to the point of isolation and the point of separation from society, where a woman is no longer capable of supporting herself, believes she's not capable of rearing her own family, believes that she amounts to nothing, and whatever she tries to do or whoever she tries to tell, no one will believe her. And I do think that it is just that little bit that is missing for years. There's incredible research out there. Frontline organizations have been doing the most phenomenal work, but we are still in a place where the people with the most experience of actually living it are left in the shadows. And CC members cross all divides of intersectionality. Our members are from various cultures, various walks of life, all sorts of backgrounds. And the common thread is when they try and stand up to do something about what they have experienced, then they're met with barriers. And I think that's what we can work together to address.
Great. Thanks, Mary-Louise. Orla, question for you. Just one of the participants talking about the observatory as a framework for collaboration and just its impact and whether that could be better resourced. And then the Istanbul Convention, is that a framework also for progressing? You might just give us some comments on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, I think the piece about the observatory is because it is that broad-based network of frontline services, but also of the other organisations like Akidwa, like Pave Point, like all of the organisations who are working on various issues, but domestic violence and violence against women is also a core part of what they do. So it's that unique coming together, I think, that makes it such a critical space, but it absolutely requires resources. And I think particularly if we want to make the convention, because all of these human rights frameworks, they are really important, but they're only important if they're really alive in people's minds and if they make a difference in terms of, you know, what needs to happen with regard to the state. So I think the job of the observatory is to make the convention a really live piece, but it absolutely needs resources to do it, and it is also resources as well around research and data, which I think is key, because otherwise it makes it very difficult to hold the state to account. A critical point will be that Ireland will have to report on the convention in 22. And that will be a big point for the observatory in terms of really holding the government to account in terms of what progress it's actually made.
Great, thanks, Orla. Mary, just you mentioned parental alienation, and again, people just asking for some clarity around the definition, what that means, what it looks like for women, and just some of the work around that and around children.
Yeah, the thing that I'd say is that the concept of parental alienation, there's a few things that just for people to know. First of all, that the very definition and the idea of parental alienation has a very checkered history, so that even as a term, it's contested and has been challenged repeatedly, you know, within the psychological traditions, and even as to whether it'll be in the diagnostic manual. From our point of view, and from all our members around the country, where we have court accompaniment, when these come forward as challenges in relation to custody and access and so on, one of the things that we always make sure we're trying to work on is where court experts are being brought in, if there is evidence or a case for domestic violence or coercive control in the case, a diagnosis, as it were, of parental alienation cannot be made. So from the point of view of those experiencing domestic violence, it's actually a defense against the accusation of about any accusations. So if there's domestic violence or coercive control evidence, you cannot bring a case of parental alienation, or the other parent cannot bring it. From our point of view, we're looking at the behaviors of parental alienation. And as far as we're concerned, what we're looking at is the behaviors that are associated with coercive control. So we actually, for the most part, don't, you know, we're not sidestepping, but we're just actually trying to refocus on coercive control. And as Mary Louise so eloquently put it, this micromanagement, the toxic triangulation, the stalking, the using of children as a weapon against you, these are actually coercive control behaviors, and we don't go there. That's in that sense.
Great, thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mary. Teresa, just in terms of, you know, I suppose the call for collaboration and the call for the diversity of women's voices to be to the forefront of any responses, you bring the group of community leaders into the room. How should we address that, or how can we amplify that a bit further?
We definitely need to talk more about diversity among service providers. That is important from both representation, but also quality of the service that is going to be provided. Having that diversity of languages amongst your service providers is important, but also that is building level of trust. If you see that people looking like you, sounding like you, are they can help you, then the trust is much higher and you will reach to those services. But also we need to look a little bit farther beyond just language provision and language barrier. Domestic abuse has that nature that is very isolating. But for migrant women is even more, especially if you have to deal with your immigration status. Many women, migrant women, have to deal first with immigration status before they even can address domestic violence. And one way of addressing that is with working with a network of migrant women working on the ground, because they already have the trust of the community. They already know who's and where and what's happening, and they can provide these links. And we've seen this very well implemented in US. in New York in particular, where community navigators are providing those necessary links between migrant women and service providers. And that is something that is tested and something that I would love to have in Ireland. I mean, we already have that. We already have women working there, especially women who took part in the We Are Here Too campaign. They just need support because they are working for free, volunteering, and they are burning out slowly. So they just need a little bit of support.
Great, thanks, Teresa.
Can I come in for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Just to follow up on Teresa's point there around diversity, there's two elements that we were very concerned about. One is that unless, and that this goes to Sarah's point too around a proper gender analysis, unless you have the right position in this, what I have seen happening is that vulnerable and marginalized groups are re-stereotyped, re-marginalized, re-alienated because the analysis is not there properly. When you have a proper gender analysis in all of this, you then don't have these stereotypes being re-articulated. From the point of view of the services, Teresa is completely correct. We need absolutely rich all-round wraparound supports with diversity at every level, front, middle, back, at service provision. What we need is a national services development plan, which we are actively working for with government at the moment. And it's really very important. Most of our services are calling for training, for expansion, and we need it. The bottom line is your local refuge and support service needs it. So I'm just supporting what Teresa's saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mary, for adding that. One final question, back to you, Sarah. One of our panelists is just asking about awareness and public awareness, and how can we make sure that, I suppose, the issues of domestic violence and broader sexual and gender-based violence are kept on the agenda. What can we do?
Well, I think we have a small amount of momentum that has been created in the current situation with the COVID-19. I think it would be fair to say that there probably has been more focus on domestic violence than some of the other forms of gender-based violence, though I know some good work has been done in relation to trafficking, women in prostitution, and indeed sexual violence. But I think what has happened is a national empathy perhaps was enhanced by literally the experiences we have all gone through, whereby we have all been told to stay at home. Our movements have been controlled. That sense of powerlessness, that sense of fear, that sense of being a little bit out of control, that has resonated, I feel. And I think Orla has mentioned there are a number of pivotal things which are happening right now, which include the government audit of its domestic, sexual and gender-based violence response. But at the same time, I think that there is a community response to be harnessed. I think there's a need for a continued pressing around victim blaming, and I think it comes back fundamentally also to what Mary has just said in terms of having the right starting point in the analysis. A gender neutral campaign, for example, serves nobody well, so the awareness needs to be done. It needs to be done in a targeted fashion, and I'll come back to what I said in relation to young people. We're talking about prevention, which means we have to be looking at the next generation at their earliest age, and that is about raising and educating young people about the fact that we can be different, but mutuality and respect are fundamental. That stereotypes, sexist tropes are still very much there. You look at the kind of the pornification of our society right now, and the hideous catch-22 that young women are being pressed into, where on the one hand they are being pressed and coerced and groomed into, for example, sharing sexualized images, and then when those images are out there, they are blamed for putting them out there, for expressing their sexuality in the context of a consensual exchange. So huge work to be done, but that all intersects with all forms of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. So I think the analysis has to be our starting point, and then targeted education, which will feed public awareness. And we haven't done a whole lot on bystander work and working with men and men as allies. And, I recognize we've been kind of having some conversations with the likes of the Men's Development Network and others. We need to intersect that more. We need to hold the analysis. And, this is Male violence against women is not a women's issue. And so I think it's really important that it isn't just women who are combating it, and that we work with allies within the context of that analysis. So.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And on that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you, all of you, for your expertise, your input this evening, and of course for all the amazing work that you do. It's been a real privilege, and we hope to keep working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.